The Lockheed A-12 Archangel, this is a wild project designed by the CIA. We're going to get into how the actual design came about. It was a strategic Mach 3 plus prototype that flew multiple missions, eventually becoming the SR-71 after a few different iterations. So we're going to get into why this thing was created, how the CIA designed it, and what design elements are actually being carried through to modern times right now. Let's dive in. The A-12 Archangel began flying missions in 1967. Now, a few of these missions went terribly wrong because this technology was new, and essentially the aerospace industry was pushing the bounds of what was even known to be possible. So multiple of these A-12s and the pilots flying them, unfortunately, were part of the cannon fodder to get to a point where this could become the SR-71 and could become a little more reliable with the wild technology that was being infused into these aircraft. But that's not the wildest part. The wildest part to me is the fact that the SR-71 program never would have come about without the A-12 Archangel. And the A-12 Archangel program never would have happened without the U-2 being shot down with the pilot inside being named Gary Powers, who was captured, and he was the figurehead for trying to create a radar cross-section that was much smaller on the U-2, and that was called Project Rainbow through the CIA. It was essentially a top secret mission for them to reduce the radar cross-section, use radar absorbent material and paints on the U-2 to get it to not be shot down by Soviet missiles. But when Gary Powers was shot down in a U-2, it just became clear that no matter how much lipstick you put on that pig, you've still got a very slow flying sitting duck aircraft that's just sitting up there ready to soak up Soviet missiles and be a big black eye for the propaganda war. So that drastically moved forward the A-12 Archangel program in the CIA. And you can bet the black program funding the development of the A-12 started to get funding after Gary Powers was shot down. No offense to Gary, but now we've got an incredible set of technology that's been used and infused into aircraft ever since. Now that's no good reason to get a pilot shot down. I realize that. But let's dive into some of the internal CIA memos of how the A-12 Archangel was actually created. So as with all things that come from aircraft design, it's a committee and a collaboration that actually works towards getting a successor for an aircraft. So the CIA was very interested in a successor for the U-2. So they brought in a few different companies to help them do that. Lockheed was the first of those companies, and they were already investigating follow-on designs for the U-2. And then a lesser known company called Convair was already trying to design a follow-on bomber for the US Air Force. And so they were in discussions with Lockheed, as well as you can guess, senior military officials from the Air Force and the Navy, as well as senior officials from the CIA. And that formed the team that started to collaborate on what the A-12 Archangel would actually become. Oh, and by the way, that bomber that was being built by Convair was called the B-58, and it was a supersonic bomber. So that's why they got a seat at the table, because believe me, there had to have been the conversation of, do we allow this strategic reconnaissance follow-on aircraft to carry bombs? And what are the strategic implications if we do allow that? Lockheed's chief engineer, Clarence Johnson, said, what's the point of just advancing the U-2 slightly? Then we only stay a few steps ahead of the Soviets. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he wanted to basically launch decades ahead of the Soviets so that when this aircraft actually became public knowledge, it just left the Soviets scrambling instead of saying, yeah, we've got something similar. So that's really the motivation and the inertia behind growing in such leaps and bounds. I mean, look at the U-2 and then look at the A-12 Archangel and then the SR-71. I mean, there's literally no comparison. And that's why the committee started to only present ideas that could fly above Mach 3 and 90,000 feet. They didn't want one or the other. They wanted this aircraft to be able to do both. So from that moment, once those two numbers were brought up, they were essentially never let go of. By September of 1958, the committee had reviewed Archangel 1, Archangel 2, all the way until they hit Archangel 12. And Archangel 12 got a big seat at the table because of its ability to fly at Mach 3 at 90,000 feet. One of the big requirements for the A-12 that a lot of the other designs didn't have was a very small radar cross-section. In order to test this radar cross-section, they built a full-scale model, put it up on a pole in the middle of the desert, and basically threw radar waves at it. That's how they were able to decide on the A-12, because its radar cross-section was way smaller than any of the A's, the A1 through 11s before that. And picking the drivers of the A-12, also called the aux cart, was a very selective process, as you could imagine. Now, I'm using a little bit of my intuition as a fighter pilot myself, but I'm diving into the requirements that they needed for these pilots to have. And they needed to have 2,000 total flight hours, with 1,000 of those being in high performance aircraft. Now, this is really important. And even during the selection going to the Thunderbirds, you had to have 750 high performance aircraft hours, because when you compare flight hours, when you're flying a high performance aircraft, everything's happening at 5 to 10 times the speed that you would think it's going to happen at, as compared to like a Cessna or even a cargo aircraft or a commercial airliner. You have to be able to think so fast. Decisions are what I like to say compounded, because if you make one little decision, that could speed the timeline up exponentially, where now, let's say you don't turn around a mountain range you're supposed to, and now you've got a massive mountain in front of you. Your options are now this big, whereas before you could have chosen any of the paths in front of you. Now you have one little shot to make it out of that situation. That's because the margin for error in high performance aircraft are so small. And that's why when they're filling the seats of this A-12 aux cart, they really wanted to make sure that these pilots had the right stuff. And then the next part of it is they wanted all the pilots to be married. Yeah, I would have failed that qualification. They wanted the pilots to be married and emotionally stable. And in this case, they related the fact of being married to being emotionally stable. And that one's up for debate. But I understand the idea of being emotionally stable. I mean, I saw it with myself and a lot of my other friends. If you're having relationship issues, or there's something going on outside of work that's distracting, it's going to detract from your performance. And ideally, you can compartmentalize that, but they didn't want these pilots to have anything on their minds that would take away from this program, because it was so sensitive, it was so classified, and the fact that in just a few months they were going to be flying this thing over heavily contested Soviet airspace, it just shows how serious they were. Although some of these rules might seem kind of silly today. So aux cart crew members actually got patches that said the word Cygnus on them, and that's the name given to the aircraft during testing. And again, it's a source of pride just having more names, more acronyms. The more you have in the military, the cooler you feel. And once these pilots are being trained up, that's the initial collaboration with the Air Force, but then a strategic partnership was formed with the Air Force to actually create specific KC-135 tankers that had special adaptations to actually refuel the A-12 and then eventually the SR-71. And then NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command, had a special agreement with the CIA to not report any of the sightings of these aircraft if they happened to be picked up on radar. So again, the creation of the A-12, the SR-71, it was a collaboration of so many different agencies. And it wasn't just about working together out of the goodness of their hearts. Once the Air Force was fully bought in on the program, it lowered the price of a lot of the different components. The A-12, the YF-12, and then eventually the SR-71A. If you have more people in that pot contributing money, the better. And then I just think it's cool to throw out there that the A-12, the SR-71, this thing burned around 22,000 pounds of fuel per hour. I mean, you talk about a gas guzzler, Priuses everywhere just threw up in their mouth. But even better than a Prius would be a Tesla. But until the day that these things become Teslas, the SR-71, the A-12, they had to be very creative with the way that they would take off due to center of gravity concerns. also the fuel tanks were basically separated, and then when it got fast up to airspeed, the fuel tanks would heat up and then come together so leaking would stop. But ultimately these things had to take off with a small amount of gas for both of those reasons, and they would have to hit a tanker within 10-12 minutes. And speaking to SR-71 pilots, it wasn't exactly a stressful situation, but you had to make sure that you were on point, you were on your game, you could get aerial refueled right away. And then you had to be ready to aerial refuel multiple times potentially throughout a mission, just due to the fact that this thing would gulp so much gas. So I think part of the coolest thing with the SR-71 program, the A-12 Archangel, is the fact that it had advanced photographic equipment built into the actual skin of the aircraft to keep the radar cross section very small. It could capture entire countries in an amount of time that is just kind of unfathomable. So I think that speaks to the fact of all the different collaborations that were done, from the airframe, the engines, the sensitive electronics, the pilot, the maintainers. All the different people involved made the A-12 Archangel really a developmental marvel that created things like reducing radar cross-section for follow-on aircraft, including F-16s, F-15s, other aircraft that had smaller radar cross-sections because someone had actually thought about it due to how much thought they put into it with the Archangel A-12. And then you add in potential radar absorbent material, radar absorbent paint, and you really have developments that have edged fighter aviation, combat aviation, reconnaissance aviation, bomber aviation to the edge of the envelope. So I tip my hat to all those involved with the A-12 Archangel program. Thanks so much for watching this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, please click another video that'll pop up over here. Oh, and I have started a podcast as well. It's not all aviation, but it's a lot based on human performance and just learning a lot more from high achievers and learning more about the world together. I'll be diving into interesting subjects on that podcast channel. Click that, that'll be in the description below. And again, thanks for watching another video. I will see you on that video. Most of all, have a great day.